right, let's start. Welcome everybody to another version of the online Hot Politics Lab. We're quickly approaching our first anniversary of the 1-year online lab. But today I am really happy that we can host Leor Zmigrod, who has been on our radar for a long period of time as a very promising researcher on the role of psychological and deeper seated processes in understanding ideological extremity and all sorts of other political behaviors. Leor has already published extensively on this topic and is also has really interesting work in the pipeline on this particular question that both Gijs and I have a strong interest in. She's currently at the University of Cambridge, and I'm really excited about having you. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. And without further ado, I will host the virtual floor to you now.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm delighted to speak to you all. I'll just share my screen and we can get going. Perfect. Does this look okay? Just checking. Yeah, perfect. So I'm really excited to speak to you today about different approaches that I've been thinking about how to really build a cognitive science of ideologies and political behavior, and how to use the tools that we have in cognitive science and neurobiology and other things, but I'll be mostly talking about cognitive science and experimental psychology today to study a diversity of ideologies, really. And I'm particularly excited to be talking to the Hot Politics Lab because from everything that I've seen, many of your research group members look at the role of emotion and emotional processes in political behavior. And so in some ways, we could be talking about your research as encompassing hot cognition, the cognition, perception, and decision-making that takes place in the context of emotional stimuli and emotional environments. And to some extent, maybe it's a little unorthodox, but I'll be actually talking about the other side of the coin. To some extent, what we can call cold cognition. So cognition that is not emotional in any way, actually. And the question that I've been thinking about is which kind of individual differences in these cold cognitive processes shape people's tendencies towards adopting and participating in ideologies. So although I am positioning myself on this other side of the coin, I promise that I will be bringing the two together and finding reconciliation and offering some research that shows how the emotional and the kind of cold cognitive aspects really come together and are together in a harmonious marriage. And that helps us explain ideologies in a better way. So kind of taking a slightly broader view, when we think about the relationship between ideological doctrines and people's psychology, for a long time, there was this kind of situational narrative that many of us are familiar with, that situations impose themselves on individuals. And so ideologies kind of coerce themselves upon individuals. And you could see this in those early 1960s social psychology experiments. And that kind of also came out of all the atrocities of the early 20th century, where they tried to emphasize how ideologies kind of impose themselves on the mind. Somewhat at the same time and kind of a bit later, we got more of these motivational theories coming up that thought about how these somewhat more emotional motivations to belong, to cohere, our existential needs, how those make ideologies appealing. They might be more appealing to particular individuals, but we all have these kinds of motivations. And today I'll be presenting a bit more of a neurocognitive story that tries to address the bidirectional links. And we can probably have a really good discussion of that afterwards, of how in some ways cognitive processes make ideologies appealing for some individuals, but then also how ideologies come back and shape cognition in return. So before I get started with all of the empirical research, it's good to think about kind of common grounds for discussing ideology, because often ideology is thought of mostly as just political ideology, just that left-right spectrum. And that's an incredibly important facet, but I've actually been thinking about it in a slightly broader way, in a way that encompasses other types of ideologies, including nationalism, racism, religiosity, all these other kinds of ideologies as well. And I've been thinking of ideologies as these rigid doctrines that describe existing social conditions and also prescribe these kinds of strict rules for how people ought to think and behave and interact with others. And because there are always adherence and non-adherence to these kinds of doctrines, there will always be a relational component. And ideologies are strongly characterized by this tendency to encourage a favoritism towards fellow in-group members, towards fellow adherents, and antagonism that sometimes takes the form of hostile antagonism and even violence towards non-adherents or non-members of that group. So when we then think about how ideologies kind of translate and seep into psychology, we can think of defining ideological thinking as the style of thinking that's rigid in its adherence to a doctrine and resistant to credible evidence-based belief updating, and that's also favorably oriented towards the in-group and antagonistic to out-groups. So this is just kind of this broad framework that we can keep in the back of our minds as we are addressing these questions. Now, the question that's been really driving me and that I'm really fascinated by is what is the relationship between low-level perception cognition, between how the brain works on a very fundamental level, and individual susceptibility to ideological thinking. Now, as scientists, we have two primary ways to address this, and I'll try to cover both kinds. The first is really theory-driven approaches, where we think long and hard about these ideological phenomena and try to think of credible theories and design hypotheses that can test those theories for us. And that's the most common way in which we approach science. But sometimes that's good when it's complemented by more data-driven approaches, where we collect these really rich data sets and then try to let the data speak. So I'll show both kinds of research and try to tie them together towards answering this question. Now studying prejudice and ideologies is not a new thing, as I'm sure all of you know. And it's always good to reference someone clever who already said something 70 years ago relevant to this topic. And Gordon Allport, in The Nature of Prejudice in 1954, wrote that a person's prejudice is unlikely to be merely a specific attitude towards a specific group, but it's more likely to be a reflection of their whole habit of thinking about the world. And so that theme, that parallel between people's ideologies and prejudices, and then more generally how they perceive the world, how their minds are working more generally, is this theme that I'll keep on coming back to. Now, the first aspect of kind of theory-driven research that I did is focusing on the cognitive domain of cognitive rigidity. And that's this tendency to perceive the world in terms of more black and white categories. And this makes it difficult for people to switch between modes of thought and to adapt to changing environments and to changing reward contingencies. And so a lot of my research is focused on individual differences and how individual differences in, for instance, cognitive rigidity and other traits relate to people's ideologies. Now, the reason I looked at cognitive inflexibility specifically is because there was this hypothesis that ideological rigidity might be rooted in cognitive rigidity. And as this kind of cartoon shows, they only taught me how to think outside the box. I'm not trained for circles. This notion that really pushing people to think flexibly is the opposite of what ideologies do, because extreme group identities and ideological beliefs are often characterized by a tendency to categorize the world and people and all stimuli in very inflexible and essentialist ways. And so the idea was that maybe individuals with a more categorical, inflexible thinking style in general might tend to adhere to ideologies in a stricter or more extreme fashion. And so to do this, we conducted a series of large online studies in the US and the UK. We have some other things with Europe, but I won't present that today. And what we do is we give them these established neuropsychological tasks that we have from the psychological literature, where, as you can see, like the picture on the screen, they're just moving these objects around. So these tasks are unrelated to politics or ideology in any way. They're ones that are just already been established in the cognitive psychology canon. And so we look at tasks such as the Wisconsin card sorting test, which is a famous task in cognitive flexibility, where individuals they learn the rule and then the rule changes and we see how well they adapt to that situation. And other similar tasks such as task switching tests, working memory tasks, divergent thinking tasks. So some of these might be more familiar to you if you're from a psychological background, but all that you really need to know is that these are classic neuropsychological tasks that tap at cognitive rigidity or these cognitive processes in very precise, objective ways. And so there's quite a large body of research, and I could probably go into this for a whole hour, but I just wanted to summarize it a little bit more briefly, that this research on cognitive inflexibility and ideologies really showed that ideologues exhibit reduced cognitive flexibility on these objective, non-ideological cognitive tests relative to non-ideologues and moderates. And I'll just give you a bit of an insight into what that looks like in practice. So in one of the kind of prominent papers where we covered this, we looked at how cognitive flexibility on 3 different tasks. So always triangulate and use multiple tasks that tap into different aspects of flexible cognition. And we found that when you measure political partisanship in terms of people's not just affiliation of, this was in an American sample, so not just Democrats or Republicans, but also when we capture the intensity of their identity. So when we ask them how fused they are with their political parties, we see this really remarkable inverted U-shaped effect, where people on the kind of extreme ends of political partisanship, either to the left or to the right, seem to perform more poorly on these very different cognitive flexibility tasks, whereas people who don't have this strong attachment to a political party do tend to perform a lot better on these cognitive flexibility tasks. So we showed this through a number of analytical tools to identify this kind of inverted shaped relationship that we kind of find again and again in the data. And I think that probably many of you who have been attentive to the ideological symmetries and asymmetries debate that's probably most prominently discussed by John Jost at NYU, and his 2017 kind of presidential address paper is a great first look at that, where often actually there's this argument that conservatives are more rigid and liberals are more flexible. But the issue so far has been with this literature that it usually uses self-reports rather than objective behavioral tasks, and it very rarely actually measures partisan intensity or extremity in any meaningful way. So that's something that actually we can come back to later. I also looked at this in the domain of intellectual humility, which is basically the reverse of dogmatism. And again, we see that on these tasks, individuals who show greater openness to revising their viewpoints, but greater respect for other people's viewpoints, also just perform better on these neutral cognitive flexibility tasks. This also interacts with intelligence in interesting ways, and I can talk about that later too. And we find that actually when we ask people about how willing they are to fight or die for a group through various measures, including kind of trolley problem dilemmas, we find that the willingness to fight for the group, willingness to die for the group is related to more cognitively rigid tendencies. So individuals who have this cognitive rigidity tend to be more willing to die and fight for the group. And also those, when they're asked whether they would be willing to die for the group, those who are more convinced of they're more confident that they would, tend to be more rigid. So that starts to get at these processes of, well, what makes some people more likely to, commit self-sacrificial acts in favor of a group, in all sorts of other extreme political actions, such as endorsing violence. So it's quite interesting to see how we can use these cognitive tools to start to get at the kind of psychological risk factors for what makes people kind of participate strongly in these groups. And so I've looked at this in the context also of nationalism, of religiosity, more on those self-sacrificial tendencies. Also in the case of political ideologies, I've reviewed more broadly, and also thinking about how all of this fits into kind of computational political psychology perspective. So that's a very quick just flavor of that kind of line of inquiry about cognitive rigidity. And now I'll try as quickly as I can to summarize a kind of different and newer approach that's maybe a little more risky and maybe a little more ambitious, but really thinks about how we can take data-driven approaches to this question. And before I show you kind of what we found, I think it's important to remember why data-driven approaches are important in the context of political psychology. And now, as many of you know, there have been these discussions about potential researcher bias in political psychology, given that academia is liberally biased. Does that affect the kind of designs and experimental paradigms that we produce? And does that really skew everything? Now, there have been good empirical work showing that it doesn't, but those concerns haven't always been alleviated. So there is this value to using data-driven approaches in addition to theory-driven approaches to make sure that our science isn't too, I guess, political, though there's merit in those discussions too. Another aspect that many of you, I'm sure, are aware with political psychology is that in terms of measurement, it's almost exclusively based on self-reports. And that's partly because of this tradition that comes from social psychology. But there's very little actual use of cognitive and behavioral measures of psychological processes. And some of the people in the Hot Politics Lab have been pioneers in terms of actually using behavioral physiological measures. And this is really important because sometimes behavioral versus self-report measures give very different effect sizes. Self-report often inflates it. And sometimes we actually even see like opposing effects when you use behavioral and self-perceptions. So really important to use both measurement tools to understand it. And another challenge is that actually our disciplines is really siloed. We have scientists who typically just deal with politics, or those who just deal with religion, or those who focus on prejudice and conspiracy theories. And obviously that's also great. People need to focus on those topics. But that sometimes means that there's a lack of integration, both in theories and approaches across all these different aspects. So this kind of data-driven approach that I took was inspired by those concerns, by the need to look at it in a more holistic way across a range of ideologies, and to see what happens when actually we don't impose our own theories on the data. And so to do that, I collaborated with Russ Poljak at Stanford University, and they'd already had a really impressive data set where they were just interested in kind of the structure, the ontology of personality and cognition. And so they gave about 500 participants a huge battery that takes about 10 hours to complete. They gave them about 2 weeks to do it. So there was a lot of quality control, and a lot of people kind of like excluded to make sure that it was really properly done. And they were interested in 2016 in just looking at the structure of kind of personality and cognition, how those interact. In 2018, I came to work with Russ at Stanford, and then I contacted some of those participants again and gave them a whole range of ideological attitude questionnaires so that we can look at how much of these cognitive and personality traits predict ideological adherence using this huge battery. And so I don't have enough time to go into the details, but maybe we can go into it in the questions. But basically what they did is they took all these huge personality tests and then used factor analysis to kind of come up with the map, the ontology of how personality is laid out. And they came up with 12 factors through this data-driven approach. And they did the same with cognitive tasks. So the cognitive tasks that were used were classic executive function tasks that kind of you might have learned about in psychology, stop signal tasks, Tower of London tasks, classic tasks. And they used some computational modeling on the task to get and extract useful parameters from them. And then they came up with 5 kind of cognitive factors that kind of reflect that space. And then I came and I looked at how that related to this huge range of ideological domains, including political conservatism, system justification, social dominance orientation, but also dogmatism and religiosity and those kinds of processes, so that we can really start building these signatures, these data-driven signatures of ideological attitudes. So this is a broad map. There were actually 16 ideological domains in there. So if you are studying any of these ideologies, I encourage you to go have a look and see whether this concords with your theories or other findings. And so we were able to create these data-driven kind of signatures of different ideologies. Here is just kind of a summary in political conservatism, dogmatism, and religiosity. And we also used all these Bayesian analyses to really try to see which traits, which processes were most implicated. And so I know that I am starting to run over time, but I will just take a couple extra minutes because I think this will be really interesting for the discussion. So I picked a few domains that I think this group will be most interested in. And first is talking about political conservatism and what we found there. So an important aspect of the kind of cognitive tasks that we gave was that many involved these kinds of perceptual decision-making tasks where people have to make these quick and accurate choices between two stimuli. Sometimes, for instance, on the right, it's about deciding whether dots are moving in a particular direction or not. Sometimes it's about indicating kind of which visual stimulus first appeared. There's a huge range, but as you can see, these are very basic perceptual processes. And what we found in the context of political conservatism is that when we use computational modeling on those kinds of two forced choice tasks where people have to make a choice between A and B, we find that individuals on these tasks, and I'll try to be as kind of general as I can, show more caution. And the way that caution is computationally analyzed here is this trade-off between speed and accuracy. So each individual has their own parameter for how much they are trying to do it as fast as they can, but with errors, or how kind of slow and accurate they're trying to be. And interestingly, we found across a number of these kind of politically conservative ideologies that conservatives tend to be more cautious. They tend to take slower perceptual strategies that are sometimes slower and more accurate, rather than kind of fast and slightly erroneous strategies. And it's interesting, right? Because caution and conservatism are almost synonyms. So it's really interesting, and I'd love to hear also what this group thinks of this, that we find that at the perceptual level, individuals with politically conservative ideologies tend to display cautious perceptual strategies. So that's really interesting. We also found, and this is not necessarily new, but it does corroborate a lot of other evidence, that political conservatives perform more poorly on kind of executive function tasks. Here they were called strategic information processing tasks. So all of these classic planning, working memory tasks, we find that political conservatives do that more poorly. So that concords with theories, and that's great, we see that. We can also look more holistically at how these kinds of cognitive processes relate to the personality domains. There are some interesting findings that we might not have thought about that maybe should inspire future research, and others that are very much consistent with what we know. So interestingly, we found that political conservatives tend to be more goal-directed in their personality, also had some kind of more reward sensitivity and impulsivity, which is interesting. But they were, and this is kind of consistent with theories, they were more averse to taking social risks, such as like not conforming in particular ways. So that kind of shows kind of one way in which we can start to see things that we might not have expected, things that we might not have necessarily seen if we just use the theory-driven approaches, but also a lot that is congruent. So really good to start validating a lot of the theories that we have. And now the last kind of domain that I want to quickly touch on, also because it's just so relevant to this month, is thinking about people's willingness to endorse violence to support their kind of ideological groups. Usually I have a cartoon, but these are images from about 2-3 weeks ago. So looking at kind of the predictors of extreme pro-group attitudes, willingness to endorse violence for the group, we find kind of some similar correlates, but also different ones. I don't have the time to talk about absolutely everything. But again, on the cognitive side, we see that caution again, which is interesting. But also on the personality side, we see a stronger effect of impulsivity and a strong effect of sensation seeking. So individuals who are out there trying to get experiences that give them a sense of thrill. So that actually is quite congruent with how we would think about extreme pro-group attitudes, but not something that I think anyone has looked at before. So Amit Goldenberg and I reviewed this in a paper that's upcoming in Current Direction, so you can have a closer look really at what we found there. And one of the other things that we discuss are the promised cognition-emotion interactions, to think about how, from an individual differences perspective, we can think of these affective dispositions and how they influence kind of political behavior, but also these cognitive ones and where the two interact. So also thinking about the kinds of interactions that exist, how, for instance, the sensation seeking and cognitive rigidity, both of which we know are implicated in tendencies towards violence and extreme ideological action. How do those interact? Do they compound each other? Do they compensate for each other? What are the potentially different types of sub-actors and sub-profiles that we can start to map out? Because not all individuals come to these ideologies or to these extreme actions through the same route. So I'm sorry if I kind of tried to squeeze in a little bit too much, but I did want to show how ideological beliefs are amenable to careful cognitive and computational analysis, both for hot and cold cognition. So this is not necessarily about that debate. And that these findings reveal both similarities and differences with past theory-driven research and offer some insights and unexplored avenues. The data-driven approach can overcome some concerns of researcher bias and maybe just researchers' limits of imagination. And it also really underscores the importance of using those two measurement types, both the self-report and the behavioral measures, because we see, and I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but we see statistically that each contributes unique variance to explaining these processes and tap into separable kind of mechanisms. And so I think that using all these methodologies, we can begin to illuminate all these cognitive characteristics of dogmatic and ideological minds, and in that process, maybe also try to see what it means to be resilient to kind of toxic ideologies and who is most resilient and open-minded. So thank you so much for listening. I'm really excited for the discussion and look forward to hearing what you think.
Thanks a lot, Leor, for this amazing presentation. So much to agree with. It's really exciting. I see questions already pouring in, but let me say a few things because I think a lot of people are present who are new. First, if you want to listen to some of our older talks, then you can also go to our Spotify and YouTube channels to listen them back. As Bert said, we've been recording for almost a year now with lots of exciting other speakers. Secondly, if you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A box and I will read the question and Leor will answer the question. And thirdly, after this meeting at 4 my time, we'll we'll do something special. We'll be using another tool called Gather Town, and we've made a little room there for people to interact, to have conversations with small groups, to have private conversations just between two people or a larger group conversation. So please join us if you want to talk more about this topic or other, political psychology related, hot politics related stuff, or football. You can also talk about football if you want to. So the idea is really that a large group of people can have conversations in smaller groups as well. All right, and we'll distribute the link and the password to that over the chat at the end of the meeting. Okay, questions for Leor. First question from Bernard Clem. Do you in general consider / study ideology as a one-dimensional concept? Yeah, that was my question too. Thanks, Bernard. If so, how does your research in the UK/US translate into other contexts where people are more hesitant to place themselves on the left-right spectrum? For example, Germany.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a great question. And in general, I guess my answer is no, in the sense that I don't study it as a purely one-dimensional concept. And I think that that's the case for many reasons, both conceptually. It's a very multifaceted concept, and that's also why I started mentioning a bit earlier about the element of dogmatism in there, the element of intolerance to others, and the element of actually the content of beliefs. So something that I've tried to distinguish in my research is the difference between the content of ideological beliefs, such as what people believe about welfare benefits, versus kind of how they believe it, how dogmatically they believe it, how resistant they are to opposing credible evidence, and also the extremity of those identities. And I've actually found that studying kind of the intensity of identities or the extremity of them, or what people are willing to sacrifice to protect their ideologies or those groups, is really, really interesting. And that's kind of linked to the second aspect of the question, where exactly in many, many concepts, I mean, I know political psychology is just really influenced by the American political kind of situation, but most other places actually have much more complex multi-group and kind of a more nuanced identities maybe. So I have actually done some research in Germany and France and other places, and usually in those contexts, it is about, on one hand, tapping into the content of their beliefs, how favorably they see immigration or not, or a range of things. I bombard them with, with questions, but also seeing how resistant they are to believing otherwise, and also how extremely they hold those beliefs and identities. So I think it's really important, both from a conceptual perspective, to see it as this multidimensional construct, and methodologically, because sometimes if we just study, are you on the left, are you on the right, that conceals so much nuance. Probably, in my opinion, the most interesting nuance there is not necessarily on the self-identification aspect, but on kind of those continua. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, great. Okay, next question from Tobias Pampati. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Thank you for the great talk. Wonderful to see your research. On your theory-driven section, could you elaborate on what ideology brings into the picture? Because one could argue that cognitive factors, rigidity, for example, might be characteristics of people who identify with a group generally. For example, being a strong Juventus fan, rather than political religious groups specifically. In other words, what makes ideological identities extraordinarily linked to cognitive factors?
Ooh, that's quite a question. Thank you. Thank you for this question. So yes, so I think here this kind of comes back to what I started mentioning about that distinction between the content of people's ideologies and groups and the particular content of those beliefs. And I think, so it's interesting because here you distinguish between what makes ideological identities rather than, for instance, being a particular fan of a group. And I've thought about this a lot, and I'm not completely convinced that the processes are that different. And hear me out on this. And I think because sometimes we might think of, for instance, football or sports fanship to be purely about that relational aspect, about I have a group and there's an out group and it's that competition, and I love everyone who believes or who is another Juventus fan and hate anyone who isn't. But also that it does feel that there's an element of dogmatism there if you are what I would say an ideological fan, which is where even when you see evidence to the contrary, that actually your group is terrible and actually you might get more benefits from kind of like following a different group. And I understand that sports psychology is more complicated than this, but I think that there can be a kind of dogmatism there. So I think that on that spectrum of kind of like from sports fans to ideologues, it really is a spectrum. I don't think that there is something about kind of like politics that is fundamentally hugely different from kind of the arena of sports. I mean, there is, in the sense that there is more bigger sets of beliefs associated with it too. And we vote for them, and there's all the kind of institutional aspect of it too. But what I mean is, I think that identifying with a group is like you're already halfway there, and for some people they will become ideological about it. They will interpret a near miss as like that was supposed to go in. Like I think that there will be that biased perception there. So that is how I see it in general. I think it's more of the spectrum. But I won't neglect the fact that we can look at kind of like what makes people, I don't know, politically conservative or religious specifically, and the features that those have. So for instance, religiosity is quite a specific one, because for many religions that involves believing in a supernatural agent, believing in a whole host of beliefs, even though I guess there's superstition involved in sports too. But the kind of psychology and cognitive science of religion has also started showing these specific things that make people more likely to believe in gods and things like that. So we can separate the content and the structure, but I think it's important to address, exactly like you mentioned, those similarities. So fascinating question, and I hope to have more empirical work for you about it soon.
All right. Thanks, Leor. We're going to the next question from anonymous attendee. Welcome back, anonymous attendee. If you would join us in the Gather Town, please call yourself anonymous attendee too. People who score high on political conservatism score both high on impulsive personality and high on caution in cognitive tasks. Intuitively, this seems to be contradictory to me. These two characteristics seem to be opposing to me. Could you explain more about how these two differ and why they could differ?
Yeah, great. So there's a number of things there. So methodologically, they're different in the sense that the impulsivity aspect is measured with self-report personality measures, whereas the caution is kind of what we extract from how people's performance in perceptual tasks. So first of all, that's kind of important to remember, because first of all, we can ask, is this a kind of self-perception feature? Though impulsivity is one that might be slightly less susceptible to social desirability than others. I don't know. So first of all, it's a methodological aspect, and that always raises questions of what is driving it. I mean, I always tend to kind of naturally, being someone from a cognitive science background, I tend to lean on the cognitive measures because those are not under conscious control and not susceptible to those social desirability biases as much. But we have to take the whole picture as it is. The thing that I didn't have the chance to go into detail, but that is probably from an analytic perspective why this result has come up, is because in this context, impulsivity is actually something that characterizes kind of adjacent ideologies to political conservatism that maybe political conservatives tend to be a little bit higher on in any case. I have some evidence suggesting that we can control for those kinds of ideologies and still see certain effects. Maybe I can quickly share a slide that would speak to this point really briefly, if I can get it up and working. And that's really the research that I looked at for dogmatism, because I think that actually the effect of impulsivity is because we see that dogmatic individuals tend to be impulsive, but also have problems with how they are kind of processing evidence from their perceptual environments. And so I think that in terms of the study, the reason that that came up is because dogmatic people tend to be impulsive. And that's part of why they have this impairment, that they kind of process evidence imperfectly. And we show that in the paper, that there are these imperfections and impairments in how they process perceptual evidence, but then they also act impulsively in general. So they are making these premature decisions based on imperfectly processed evidence. And that seems to be a really interesting cognitive profile of dogmatism. So with the dogmatism research, I have, for instance, controlled for the effect of political conservatism and still see impulsivity as an important aspect of dogmatism. We need to check whether that works the other way. So in other words, this could also be a feature of other adjacent kind of ideological features coming into play. But that's a speculation at this point.
Great, thanks. Next question is from Diamantis Petropoulos Petalas. Thank you so much. I so much appreciate your perspective in approaching the ideological mind. I was wondering if you'd like to elaborate a bit more on the neural approach mentioned. Have you considered any relevant neural mechanisms in your studies and how you view the role of cognitive neuroscience and its added value for political science? I'm pretty sure you can talk for maybe 2 hours about this, but we have 7 more questions and 15 minutes, so bear that in mind.
Perfect. I will do it as quickly as I can. So thank you for that excellent question. I think I'll kind of start answering the second part first. I think political neuroscience is really interesting, and on one hand has a lot of potential. And actually, I guess this is a bit of a plug. In exactly a month from today, on the 22nd of February, we have a special issue coming out that looks at political neuroscience and includes some really recent cutting edge research on political neuroscience showing how it's useful. So maybe I'll leave that as a mysterious answer, and maybe if you follow our channels, you can see that coming up. And in terms of my studies, I do have neurobiological work ongoing with kind of longitudinal neuroimaging designs and genetic designs. So all of that should come up in the next year or two. So again, I'll keep it mysterious, but the answer is yes, I've considered all of them, and I think they can be useful if done correctly.
Good, thanks. Then continuing with Isabella Rebasso. Thanks a lot for the talk. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a bit on the covariates included in the model. How can we rule out that differences in cognition, such as caution or memory, are not due to differences in, for instance, age, gender, education?
Great. Yeah, I can answer that fairly quickly in that everything I've shown you today always controls for age, gender, and education. So there we go.
But what happens before you control for this?
So it's interesting in terms of, let's say, cognitive rigidity, because we use multiple tests, sometimes age is relevant and sometimes it's not. And sometimes it's sometimes we think of old people as kind of more rigid, right? And maybe that's kind of where Isabella's good question is coming from. But that doesn't seem, first of all, to be super consistent, actually, because in some measures of cognitive flexibility, actually old people perform better. And so it's non-linear, but it seems to never be an issue when we control for it. So all regression analyses I ever do control for these things, and that's included in everything you've seen.
Good, okay. Continuing to a question from Alexei Polunin. Thanks for the presentation. In the number of slides, a temporal discounting was mentioned as a variable. Would you tell, please, how this was measured in these experiments?
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. So we found some interesting things with temporal discounting for political conservatism, which actually, if Alexei, you have any ideas for what it means, feel free to reach out. In the sense of how we measure them with classic temporal discounting measures of what kind of rewards people would forego kind of on a temporal dimension now versus far in the future. So we used a number of those kind of established measures. And it's interesting that we see kind of temporal discounting being related to political conservatism. I haven't seen anything about that in the literature, and I'm still trying to interpret what that means. So thank you for noticing that.
To be continued.
Yeah.
All right. Next question. We're going fast. Roman Chuchel. Thank you. Really interesting. Could you elaborate or speculate a bit more about how we think your low-level cognitive concepts link to political ideological dogmatism? Do you think the main mechanism lies in a stronger tendency for motivated reasoning, or maybe other forms of behavior?
Thank you. That's a great question. I love that question. So the way I've been thinking about it, and I've hinted at bidirectional links, but if we just more take how, for instance, kind of low-level cognitive and perceptual traits relate to ideological behaviors, I have been thinking about it in terms of the way in which, for instance, if you are cognitively rigid, you have a kind of affinity for rigid narratives that ideologies provide. And so I've been thinking about it in terms of kind of like an affinity for those kinds of worldviews that would make you more attracted to that, versus if you're more cognitively flexible, those are not necessarily things that are cognitively or perceptually satisfying, I guess. This is where really interesting kind of conversations come into play about the link between motivations and cognition. And we often think of cognition in terms of motivation. And even as I'm talking, I'm using language such as appeal, and that has kind of the motivational language there. And so these are to some extent really good open questions, and quite hard to think of how we can design kind of causal studies that show that, you know, like why exactly it is that cognitively rigid individuals become ideologically rigid. So I've made that link, and I think that that link is because of those kinds of like natural affinities that people's cognitive toolkits have for those kinds of social narratives. But that is also a great open question that I hope to continue addressing in my career. So I feel like all my answers end up with "to be continued," but I hope that addresses it a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I think I guess "to be continued" is a more exciting answer than you should have read 1980 or something. It isn't available anywhere, but yeah. All right, let's continue. We have a question from Kostas Kiritsopoulos. Very interesting. Following up on some of the previous question, ideological structure is sometimes argued to have resource-oriented as component as well as a social value-oriented component. Do you see any reliable difference between contexts involving ideologies involving resource sharing versus inequity, or, and then I have to scroll down, or social value concerns? It's clear to you? Okay.
Yeah, I think so. That's really interesting. Something that a paper that I love and that I really recommend if you're interested in these kinds of questions is by Amy Krosh and Amodio 2019 in JPSP, I think, where they show how kind of scarcity situations make individuals, they put them in fMRI scanners and EEG while they were doing a resource allocation task that involved faces that were either Black or white. And these were white participants. And they showed how like being in a scarce situation effectively caused people's kind of face processing area to, in some sense, dehumanize Black faces, to see them less as faces. Which is, I think, insane and fascinating, and probably one of the best examples of political neuroscience, kind of going back to an earlier question about its utility, showing how you can see kind of the neural effects of almost dehumanization in particular contexts. So that was a context that was purely about resource allocation, not about like social values. And we see how that heightens that link between neural kind of components and ideologies, like in this case, kind of racism. So your question is quite complicated because you asked whether there are reliable differences between contexts involving ideologies that are about resource sharing or those that are about social values. I don't know if I've seen a lot of work that really distinguishes between those two kind of categories. I'm also trying to think what ideologies I would put in the resource sharing or social value. I'm almost struggling to, like, I'm thinking system justification, social dominance, and I'm kind of struggling to think how they are purely resource sharing or purely social value. I mean, there's really good work about economic system justification, but that's still a social value. So those two aspects seem really infused to me. I'll continue thinking about this question. It's a good one. If you have any work that shows that suggests the kind of division between ideologies about resources and ideologies about social values, I'd be interested in thinking more about that conceptual distinction.
Okay. Next question from Matthijs Roduin. Thanks a lot, Leor. Very interesting talk. I was wondering about two things. First, to what extent is cognitive flexibility related to education? For instance, does education mediate the effects of cognitive flexibility, or does education make people more cognitively flexible? Shall we deal with that one first and then the second one?
Sure. Yes, there are many ways in which I can respond to this. One is that we do control for education. In general, there sometimes is an effect, like before I think about ideology, sometimes there's an effect of education on cognitive flexibility, as we kind of presume, but it doesn't have a strong impact on why we see the results between ideology and cognitive flexibility. In the paper that I have on intellectual humility and cognitive flexibility, I also include cognitive ability, so looking at intelligence, and maybe that's and I mean that is related to educational attainment in various bidirectional ways, and we see that interacts with cognitive flexibility in that people who are either cognitively flexible or intelligent seem to be non-dogmatic or like quite intellectually humble and open to other perspectives and to credible evidence. I was interested to see that it actually wasn't additive in the sense that being very intelligent and very flexible doesn't make you like the least dogmatic. So there are actually quite interesting interactions there that suggest that there's almost like a compensatory mechanism going on between kind of cognitive ability and cognitive flexibility. So I think that speaks a bit to your question.
The follow-up there is, how about the effect the other way around when it comes to the relationship with ideology? It might seem far-fetched, but could endorsing some specific ideologies also make people less or more cognitively flexible?
Great. Yes, and that's a great question that I think I've most easily and enjoyably looked at in the context of religion, because religion is a really interesting case because we can see people who adopted an ideology later in life, who, for instance, grew up in an atheist background and then chose to adhere to ideologies, and also those who decide to leave those religious ideologies and like grew up in a religious devout home but became atheistic later in life, or those who stayed atheistic or stayed religious. And so I have a paper on religious disbelief and cognitive flexibility that you might find interesting, because it does seem that there are these really interesting relationships between, first of all, kind of your upbringing versus your later like adult choice and those categories. So people who choose to enter religion from an atheistic background are actually the most rigid group, which is really interesting. And so that does make you feel that to some extent there is an effect of kind of like being drawn to. But then about the other way, like you're suggesting, it does also look like there's effects of upbringing, and there's also effects of how much you participate in that ideology. So I've measured things like how frequently you attend services, how often you pray, things like that. And those are really interesting ways to look at the effects of ideology in a way. And I have work now ongoing, hopefully will come out in like a year, that looks at that context in religion and upbringing and on a kind of more longitudinal developmental trajectory too. So thank you.
Okay. Two more questions, rather short ones. I think Adrian Ruffers, thanks for the interesting talk. I have a question on the ideological rather than the cognitive part. If dogmatism is operationalized via belief strength and resistant to updating, how could it be disentangled from political sophistication?
Yeah, great question. I think, so I've often struggled with the political sophistication literature, to be honest, because I mean, I know it's history in political science as part of those discussions about whether people who are ideological, like I think in early political science discussions, they said that someone who's ideological is someone who knows a lot about that ideology and is able to have ideology. So there used to be this idea that actually you're not ideological if you are almost too dumb to have an ideology. That's effectively the sentiment. And since then, I've kind of struggled with the political sophistication variable or political knowledge in general, because it seems to me to confound quite a few things. Like you are clearly mentioning, like how can it be disentangled from dogmatism? I mean, I think that really dogmatism is, or its inverse, is about how receptive you are to credible evidence, to credible kind of opposing arguments. So not just to anything, right? So it's not about being moved by whatever you see, but it's about how dogmatic you are with what you know. So I think that a person can be politically sophisticated and dogmatic, and also politically sophisticated and not dogmatic, because you are still receptive to new information and to kind of new evidence coming your way. So I guess in a sense, your political knowledge is more malleable with respect to evidence, and less resistant. So I think that the two can be effectively distinguished, both methodologically in terms of how we measure them and conceptually. But it's a great question actually to think about kind of what characterizes, like if we think about it as kind of like all those quadrants of sophistication and dogmatism, what characterizes the dogmatic and sophisticated person versus the undogmatic but unknowledgeable person. So actually a great empirical question there.
Yeah, Bert?
Yes, thanks, Leor. This is exciting. So my question is a little bit related to this computational approach, but maybe zooming out a little bit. So I, as personally started to, as a kind of a firm believer of all the asymmetry ideas until some of the null findings we've had in this lab made me more critically reflect upon the status of this literature at large. And one of the, maybe I'd like to ask you a question about the sizes of the effects, because a lot of the, what you say is like conservatives are lower on this or higher on that. But how big are these effects and how meaningful are these differences? Because it seems on average that your effects are not super big. So it means that there are a lot of conservatives who are actually not very rigid. And there are actually a lot of liberals who are rigid. So how important is it to see? So because I think it's an important question, because we talk in this political psychology literature a lot as if people from the left and the right come from two different, completely different psychological worlds. But the empirical evidence seems to suggest that, well, there are tiny differences.
So your question is like, how do I respond?
Yeah, well, so my question is, what is the size of the effects that we see here, and how meaningful are these differences in understanding the differences between people?
I think that's great. I think, and a really difficult question probably for the field more broadly. I think that in the manuscripts that we have for the data-driven one, something that we did is we compared the kind of the contribution of demographic variables versus cognitive variables versus personality variables to explaining these ideological phenomena. And something that actually really surprised me is that, for instance, things that we've been talking about, like age, education, gender, those actually describe like only about 8% of the variance. And so when actually we add personality and cognitive variables, we can start getting up to explaining about 30–40% of the variance in kind of like these ideological dispositions. And so I know that this is kind of a tangent to your question, but I guess that was something that surprised me, because I guess we hear so much about age, gender, education as explanatory variables of political behavior and ideologies more broadly, that I was almost surprised by how much these cognitive and personality traits contributed. So that, I guess, is one thing that has kind of shaped my thinking. You asked more specifically about the rigidity work itself. And I think that, I mean, yes, I'm not going to say that these effect sizes explain all of polarization. I mean, I wouldn't expect them to either, because I mean, this like one aspect of a huge picture, which is also to some extent why the data-driven stuff is exciting, because we get to see what a broader range of variables can do in tandem. And I think that this is part of that really interesting discussion about, we might have small, moderate effect sizes. And what do we do with that, both theoretically And in terms of if we want to, we have these ambitions to create these expansive models that predict political behavior to, the most that we can, what would we want to include in there? And really, how do we isolate the psychological processes from the political processes? Because I don't think it's that ingenious to say, oh, well, I can predict someone's conservatism from asking them about their system justification. Like that feels like ideology predicting ideology. And sure, we can get to big R squares, but I don't know if we're answering any question that's scientifically interesting in a sense, or that really illuminates the kind of how their brains are actually processing information. So I guess I've attacked your question in multiple different.
No, it's also something I think we should be thinking. It's something I'm thinking about, and I want to thank you, Leor, for this excellent talk, and I think it sparked a lot of questions from the members in the audience, which is always great. Let me take the opportunity also to announce a couple of the speakers that we have in the coming weeks, especially because there are quite some new people. So on our lab website, hotpolitics.eu, you can find our schedule all the way up to June. But next week, we have two graduate students, Lynn Andrea Fiek, who's at the University of Oslo, and Tristan Klingelhofer. Then the week after, we have Konstantin Boursales. On February 12th, we have Jana Krupnikov from Stony Brook University. On February 19th, Michael Bruter from the LSE. March 5th, we have Gerben van Kleef from the University of Amsterdam. And then March 12th, Ben Rouge from the University of Leiden. So a lot of interesting talks, I think. Leor, at some point in life, we hopefully be able to meet each other in person. And then we'll also hand you over infamous Hot Politics Lab mock that as a token of appreciation for being here. I want to invite the attendees to join us to this other platform that we are using that is called Gather Town, and there you can interact with other people, among others, Gijs and myself and Christian, and maybe you have some time, Leor, to hang out as well. But again, thanks a lot for today's exciting talk.
The link is in the chat box.
Yeah. Oh yeah, in the chat box.